Welcome to Barbados.
Yes, beautiful Barbados. The Caribbean island welcomes well over 500,000 tourists every year. Not bad for a nation with a population hovering around 250,000.
Tourists come to Barbados because of our friendly nature, our smile, we're always willing to assist, to help, and to put them right back on track.
And believe you me, it is easy to get lost in the beauty of this 166 square mile island, the easternmost in the Caribbean chain.
We have the Atlantic side, which is the East Coast. That's where we normally have our soup bowl. When you have the surfing, that's very rugged and rough from where we are here on the West Coast. Very great in terms of photo opportunities on the East Coast. And the West Coast is, in Barbados, we say it's the Gold Coast. It's very calm and passive over this end of the island.
The West Coast is home to most of the 104 hotels on the island, including the well-known Crystal Cove Hotel.
Crystal Cove is situated on the west coast of the island. It's an all-inclusive property. We carry 88 rooms here. Crystal Cove Hotel offers 2 restaurants and bars, complimentary water sports activities, which are inclusive of motorized water sports. We also offer a water taxi. The hotel also offers the fitness center, floodlit tennis courts, and a kids club. Guests come back year after year. They want to see a familiar face. It's a home away from home. It's like coming home.
And metaphorically speaking, it is like coming home for a significant portion of tourists to Barbados. While plenty of Americans visit the island, a plurality of the tourists come from the United Kingdom. And for good reason. While Barbados became an independent nation in 1966, Barbados had been a British colony for centuries.
1627 is the year of settlement, English settlement on the island.
Yes, the British settled Barbados in the early 17th century and controlled the island for over 300 years. So in traveling around the island in the 21st century, you can still feel that British influence today. From metrics, to driving on the wrong side of the road, to the countless cricket competitions along the Bajan countryside, Barbados beams British. Now for one community, the early English settlement of Barbados proved pivotal to their very existence. That community, Sephardic Jews who had moved to the Americas early in the 17th century. But before delving into the migration of Jews to Barbados, let's look back even further into the history of Sephardic or Spanish Jews.
The classical definition of a Sephardic Jew is a Jew simply who traces his or her ancestry to the Iberian Peninsula. According to Jewish tradition, they have been there since the time of the first temple, which was destroyed in Jerusalem in 70 of the Common Era. But there's another Jewish legend that has them settling there even before that,
Really?
in 5 before the Common Era. And probably most likely because they did not want to have anything to do with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, 33 CE.
And the first several centuries of the last millennium had been considered a golden age for the Sephardic Jewish community living throughout Spain and Portugal on the Iberian Peninsula.
If you go to some of the early literature written about the Sephardim in the Iberian Peninsula, you see where they're referred to as the aristocracy of the Jewish world. They were often courtiers among the Spanish monarchs. Also, remember that in the 12th, 13th, and the early 14th century, much of Spain was also Islamic. So under the Moorish caliphates, you had Sephardic Jews who were in senior positions in the caliphates.
So there was a period of efflorescence in various fields: architecture, science, philosophy, linguistics. There was interaction between the 3 monotheistic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam.
The Jewish world, the heart of the Jewish world, the intellectual, cultural, artistic world was in Spain.
In fact, one of the greatest Jewish minds of all time lived in Sephardic Spain.
In Spain, you had Maimonides, who had this once-in-a-millennial genius, who was not only a great rabbi and a writer, he was a businessman, he was a physician, he was a philosopher who was comfortable with Greek philosophy.
But the fate of this man presaged the future for Sephardic Jews.
Suddenly, Maimonides found it difficult to live as a Jew. And many people say that he had to go undercover and hide his Judaism. He visited Israel, which was a holy place, but he couldn't live there. He lived in Egypt, in Fostat, but that's not where his heart was. His heart was always in Spain.
As was the hearts of hundreds of thousands of Jews.
It is estimated that perhaps the Sephardic population at any given point in time in the Iberian Peninsula was in excess of 200,000, and it may have been even more than that. Anywhere between 15 to 20% of the population of the Iberian Peninsula was Sephardic.
From the 10th to the 15th century, the Jewish communities in our country shared their lives, their hopes with Muslims and Christians until the decree of expulsion signed in 1492 by the Catholic kings made an important and tragic change in the social and cultural life of medieval Sepharad.
Now, when most Americans hear the year 1492, the historical event that immediately comes to mind, the Spanish monarch's decision to send Christopher Columbus on his voyage to the New World. Yet for world Jewry, 1492 marks a sad chapter in Jewish history. On the same day that Christopher Columbus set sail, the King and Queen of Spain issued their Edict of Expulsion. The Spanish Inquisition had begun.
So 1492 is a pivotal year. Of course, it's the expulsion of the Jews after a series of attempts to integrate the Jews into the community by, in 1391, forcibly converting hundreds of thousands of them. That did not work because many of them continued to have a Jewish identity in secret. And in fact, the Jews who had not been converted were influencing these converts to return to their ancestral Judaism. And that is what led Ferdinand and Isabel to decide, okay, we have to solve this problem once and for all. We want a unified nation and we need to expel the Jews so they will not influence these conversos, these new converts. And that is why they expelled them.
For Jews, they were presented with impossible choices. You either had to abandon the faith of your fathers and convert to Christianity, or you had to practice Judaism in secret, become a crypto-Jew or a Marrano. You had to leave the country that you were living in and seek exile elsewhere. If you were a crypto-Jew, you appeared to be following Christian theology, but if you retained the religion of your fathers and you practiced Judaism and you were discovered, you would then face torture and almost certain death, and sometimes that death could be very horrific, where in what was called an auto da fe, people were actually tied to stake, sometimes whole families were tied to stake and burnt to death.
Perhaps about half of them went over to Portugal, and then there was a mass conversion in 1497.
And Portugal's Sephardic community, even before the flood of Spanish Jews arrived, made up a vibrant part of Portuguese society, totaling 10% of the overall population, or about 150,000 people.
Those members of the Sephardic community that were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula either made homes in North African towns and cities, or in the Levant, as far across as Turkey, or they made their way to northwestern Europe, where a large number settled in what we know of as Holland today, which originally was called the Low Countries, and would have settled in cities like Amsterdam. Amsterdam had the major Sephardic community of northwestern Europe. And then from Amsterdam, of course, once the Dutch conquered the northeastern tip of Brazil, which was held by Portugal, but which, because of the union of the Spanish and Portuguese thrones, had then become part of the Spanish Empire under Charles V. Then you had a Dutch community being set up in Recife, in Brazil, in the what is today the states of Pernambuco and Bahia, which were sugar-producing states. And because the Dutch were tolerant from a point of view of religion, then a Sephardic community established itself in Recife, with 2 synagogues and a vibrant community.
In fact, when Dutch Prince Maurice issued his Edict of Religious Toleration, New Holland, the Dutch name for their colony in northeast Brazil, became the first legal settlement for Jews anywhere in the New World. And when the Sephardic community in Recife consecrated the Kahal Zur Israel Synagogue in 1636, the temple became the first Jewish congregation in the New World. And some historians estimate that at its peak, Dutch Brazil had a larger Jewish population per capita than even Amsterdam, with the Jews of Recife comprising 35% of the white population. But the Dutch adventures in Brazil during the 1600s did not last long.
By the late 1640s, the Portuguese were fighting a battle of reconquest aimed at driving the Dutch out of Brazil. And of course, this was achieved. And the Sephardic communities then were faced with the dreadful choice of would they remain in Brazil? And if so, under what conditions would they remain in Brazil? Would they once again become crypto-Jews? Would they become Christian? Would they become subject to the Inquisition and the Auto da Fe? Or would they leave and go back to Amsterdam or other capital cities in Europe, or do what they did, which essentially was to look for islands in the Caribbean to settle. And Barbados was one of those islands.
Remember, the English, not the Spanish or Portuguese, were able to settle Barbados in the 1600s.
Theoretically, Spain claimed the entire Americas. So Spain claimed all of the Caribbean, but they only occupied the islands known as the Greater Antilles. They occupied Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. The smaller islands of the Lesser Antilles were too insignificant for Spain to have an interest in. So by the 17th century, when northwestern Europe, and primarily Holland, England, and France, were looking for colonies in the Caribbean, they then occupied these islands that had not been occupied by Spain.
Such as the island of Barbados. And as a result, Barbados became safe from the arm of the Spanish Inquisition for descendants of Spanish Jews who had immigrated to Holland and then Brazil. But that was not the only reason why the expelled Jews of Recife chose Barbados as their new home.
What the Jews had was expertise in creating sugar, in growing the sugar cane, in the harvesting of it, and of course in the export of the commodity sugar and rum.
There was encouragement given to the Sephardic Jews who had that knowledge of the sugar industry to migrate to Barbados.
In fact, in 1655, 2 of the most prominent members of the Sephardic community in Recife requested special permission to relocate to Barbados from the highest levels of the British government.
A letter had been written to Oliver Cromwell requesting permission for the Jews to come and settle in Barbados.
That permission was granted before England then raised the ban on Jews living formally and officially in England.
And that entry set into motion a major economic advancement for the island.
That letter was written by Dr. De Mercado, who's in our graveyard. His son is incidentally brought the working plans of the windmill to Barbados and propelled Barbados into a modern mechanized era.
And records indicate that by no later than 1660, this transplanted Jewish community had constructed a synagogue with accompanying cemetery in the largest city in Barbados, Bridgetown.
The first documentary evidence we have comes from a land plat dated 1660, which shows quite clearly the existence of a synagogue. So we know that the synagogue predates 1660. The accepted date for the construction of the synagogue here is 1654. The first known Jewish burial, the first tombstone, dates from 1658. There could very well be earlier burials.
And the community recently uncovered something likely older than even the 1650s era synagogue and cemetery, which we will discuss later on in the program. We'll be right back. Numbering 100 to 200 souls, the early Sephardic settlers in Barbados did encounter some pushback from their Christian neighbors on the island.
Jews were not given equal rights for the whole of the 1600s, primarily because there was great suspicion.
And in fact, a man called Haynes wrote a polemic that was published in London, accusing the Jewish merchants of Barbados of underhand dealings. And the local House Assembly, which was composed largely of planters, actually passed legislation which restricted Jewish families in Bridgetown from owning more than one slave per household. But that edict was very quickly rescinded, and in less than 30 years it was completely rescinded, and then Jewish families could own any quantum of slaves that they wanted to, if they had the money. Because honestly, they had to face the reality of the situation, and the reality of the situation was that in a slave-owning society, the society functioned largely on the backs of the enslaved population, and it was, impractical to deny a segment of the free population the right to own slaves.
And not surprisingly,
in Barbados, the Jewish, not necessarily slave master, but the Jewish male, certainly procreated in Barbados, because we have, for instance, the descendants, and there are...
Well, we'll get into their descendants later. Now, with the elimination of these barriers, the Jewish community of Barbados thrived.
This building, particularly, was built in 1750. As far as we know, it was the Jewish Community School. It's built of hand-cut coral stone. The coral stone itself is millions of years old, so it's literally a fossil building. And that is important because the buildings in Barbados of that era were usually built with coral stone, and the beauty of it is that it is similar to Jerusalem stone.
You'll start with the arrival of nuclear families in the 1650s, and the community grows from 1 or 200, so that by the middle of the 18th century, it peaks at anywhere between 700 and 800 members.
And a Jewish community of that size translated to 10% of the entire population of Bridgetown, Barbados. But as the 18th century marched on, the Barbadian Jewish community began to dwindle.
1750, there was a decline in sugar production. We had a disease that hit the sugar crop, which literally decimated that. And so the cost of producing sugar went up, profits went down, and they began to leave the island.
And then with the American Revolutionary War and the creation of the United States of America, you get a gradual draining off of the community as members then migrate to what will become the huge metropolis of New York, Philadelphia, Charleston in South Carolina, Newport.
In fact, 15 Sephardic families from Barbados seeded Newport, Rhode Island's Jewish community when they immigrated to the colony. And Newport's Thoreau Synagogue, constructed in 1763, and currently the oldest synagogue still standing in the United States, was made famous when none other than President George Washington wrote to Thoreau in 1790, "For happily the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants." But the migration of the Barbadian Jews to the American colonies drained the community.
So within a 75-year period from 1750 to approximately, say, 1825, you have a mass immigration. Some of them married into Christian families. Some left the island just because they couldn't find anything to do. But it moved from 800 down to 91.
By the early 1800s, again, you read the minutes of the Muhammad, and you can see that there's a sadness creeping in to the individuals who are taking the minutes. They refer to things like the diminution of our once glorious congregation.
And then by 1833, just after the Great Hurricane, they're down to just 71.
When the hurricane destroyed the roof of the synagogue, rather than throwing up their hands in despair and saying, our community has almost been depopulated. We're down to just a few people. It's very difficult to get a minivan together. But no, they said no. In fact, if you read the minutes, rays of hope come through.
We know it was rebuilt by 1833 and had a grand reopening where the high life of Barbados were invited to participate in the affair.
Yet, despite the excitement surrounding the grand reopening of the synagogue in 1833, the community did not rebound.
By the second half of the 19th century, the drain on the community starts to take its toll.
By 1867, you only have approximately 7 financial members in the synagogue. By 1925, there's just one practicing Jew, Joseph Beza.
He found it difficult to maintain a synagogue because there was no one with him that was practicing the faith.
He was in his 80s. He could no longer afford to maintain the temple. And so he wrote to Bevis Marks in London.
Everything is sent to the Bevis Marks congregation in London. And then the synagogue is sold, but with the proviso that the burial grounds be maintained by whoever purchases the synagogue.
But that one proviso, the requirement for the maintenance of the cemetery, allowed the Jewish history of Barbados to be kept alive, actually by a Barbadian lawyer named Eustace Shilstone.
He himself was not Jewish, okay, but he had this great interest in preserving the history.
So Mr. Shilstone, as a child, being led through the synagogue and being told about all these old Jewish families, he developed an interest in Judaism and an interest in the graveyard. And later on, as a solicitor, his office was quite close to the graveyard. He'd go and he'd clear away the heavy overgrowth, and he copied down the various inscriptions.
And through the Jewish Historical Society of London, in 1956, Shilstone published the book Jewish Monumental Inscriptions in Barbados. Now, while Shilstone was preserving Sephardic Jewish history in Barbados, a nascent Jewish community was developing on the island, who has continued Shilstone's work to recover the sacred history of the early Jews of Barbados. As the original Sephardic community in Barbados died out in the late 1920s, Ashkenazi or Eastern European Jews were sensing the storm clouds on the horizon on the continent.
With the rise of fascism in Europe, it became quite clear to some Jewish families looking down the line that the medieval pogroms would be nothing compared to what fascism would unleash on the Jewish communities of Europe. So then you had a new wave of Jewish migration to the Caribbean.
And in 1931, a Polish Jew from Lublin arrived in Barbados.
Moses Altman, my grandfather, came here in 1931. And he came here initially because he was traveling to South America and the ship that he was on stopped in Barbados. He knew that Barbados offered him an opportunity to get a British passport, and he felt that with such a passport he could then go to England, he could go to the United States or elsewhere. In 1932 he brought his children here, 5 children and his wife, and one of them of course is my father, the eldest of those 5 children. And once they came here, they began to feel that this was not a bad place to stay. Soon after, he brought his immediate family, he brought over cousins and friends, and each one of them brought more of their connections. And within 10 years, they had approximately 40 families that came from various parts of Europe, mainly Poland, that settled in Barbados.
And consider the ramifications to Moses and his descendants if he had not moved his family from Lublin, where the Nazis built and operated the Majdanek concentration camp. In the coldest terms, out of Lublin's 42,000 Jews who had made up over 1/3 of that city's population, no more than 300 survived the Holocaust. Put differently, consider the fate of Paul Altman's mother's family, who also hailed from Poland.
My mother, unlike my father, came from a family of means, and they lived in Warsaw. and she was studying in London. And there weren't many people at that time that could have afforded to do that. Her family were fortunate. She had a twin sister who was a lawyer in Warsaw. She had another sister. They were all well off and didn't sense that they were in any way threatened. As a result of that, she was the only surviving member of her family.
And the Altmans and those early Ashkenazi families tried not to look back and worked to build their lives on the island of Barbados.
They came here and they didn't have much other than themselves, and their strength and ability and enthusiasm to play a role and to become very much a part of this Barbadian community.
And this burgeoning Jewish community sought a congregation for worship, given that the Sephardic Ninche Israel Sanctuary had been sold in the 1920s.
In my youth, it was a place of business offices. The Barbados Turf Club actually had their offices in the synagogue, and the top floor had been closed in, and it had been altered considerably.
And the first place that was used for worship was my grandfather's house, which my father built, and the house was called Maccabee. And Maccabee, they had a special room that they used for religious services. And that's where I was bar mitzvahed, at Maccabee. Soon after my bar mitzvah, they bought a property which we still own today, and the property was a small house in Rockdinier Road that was converted and used as a place of worship. And that is known as True Blue.
Now, the Ashkenazi Jewish community of Barbados may have remained satisfied with True Blue, but a land use proposal by the Barbadian government around 1980 created an opportunity the community could not pass up.
The government of the day wanted to destroy the temple, dig the graves out, and put the Supreme Courts here.
And they were then wanting to encroach on the graveyard, and my father said that there was no way that anyone was going to touch a grave in order to make way for a Supreme Court building. And my wife and I then took the bit, so to speak, and we went and did research. We found the original photographs of the synagogue, showing it in its glory. We found those in the Shulston Library in the Barbados Museum. And I rushed with those, literally rushed to the Prime Minister, who gave me a lot of time. Tom Adams, who was Prime Minister. And when I went to Tom Adams and took those photographs and I said to him, "This is what you're destroying," he said, "No way, we're not going to destroy that building. In fact, if you can find the money to restore it, we will hand it to you and allow that restoration to take place." I think we raised more than $1 million.
Actual restoration of everything in there so that it looked like the original was based on black and white photographs taken in the middle 1800s.
But raising the funds to renovate the synagogue only did just that, renovate the synagogue. The synagogue had to be filled with the precious artifacts that had once adorned this building. That task proved quite a challenge. At times, the results were not as hoped.
When we discovered that the original chandeliers from Barbados were at the Winterthur Museum in Delaware, and we tried to get them to give us back the original chandeliers, and they wouldn't. I called a Mr. Shapiro, who was at that time the chief executive of DuPont.
We would have replicas made. And you can have the replicas and we can keep the originals. You can send the originals back to us. And they said, "We have a better idea. We will keep the originals. You can have the replicas." So we have replicas.
When I was doing the restoration, I got in touch with Bevis Marks and I said, "Look, can you help us?" Bevis Marks said, after they checked, they said, we would love to, but really it's a different community. We were Sephardic, you are Ashkenazi. So for the first time, Paul Altman discovered that among Jews, you had people who could differentiate and say, we are one and you're the other. They wouldn't give us anything back.
I was told of a very sad story recently by a descendant of one of these Jewish families. His great aunt had boxes and boxes of items that she'd kept in her house. And when she died, her descendants, not knowing anything of the importance of these items and not interested in them, simply put them by the roadside and they disappeared.
Other times, the results were better than could have been imagined, which we will uncover when we come back. The new Jewish community in Barbados remained undeterred in their quest to recover some of the synagogue's historical artifacts.
The story starts with Lady Carter. She was the wife of a British governor who remained in Barbados after he had died. And they bought a property near where Government House is, which is called Ilara Court. When we were restoring the synagogue, the Prime Minister at the time was Sir Bernard St. John, and he again lived at Ilara Court with his wife Stella, Lady Stella, and they knew that these 10 commandments were from the synagogue, and she called me up, and Stella, and said to me, because I knew them, and Stella said, "Paul, look, you can come and collect these 10 commandments and put them back where they belong." And it didn't take me long to go and collect them. These were candelabra type lights because there was no electricity in the original days. And those were owned by a Barbadian family who were no longer Jewish. And the family were in the process of moving away from Barbados. And I heard that they had these candlesticks, and asked them if they would sell them and give them back, and they said absolutely no way. And I tried, and I finally gave up, and a few days later had a call from someone who knew me and had heard that I was trying to get these things back. And when I said that they were wasting their time, they said, "You leave it to me." Within an hour they called me and said, "Go and pick them up." And I said, "Well, how did you manage?" And she said, "Well, I told her the story that my father told me. And that story was that when I was a child, my father took me to the synagogue when it was being emptied, it was sold, and the artifacts were being removed. And he said, if you ever have a chance to do something for this synagogue, you must do it." And she said, once I told her about that story that my father told me when I was a child, she kind of broke down and said, "Look, come and take them."
The construction effort proved arduous. It took a dedicated team of workers bringing various areas of expertise to the project. But after 4 years of hard and meticulous work, in 1987, Barbados celebrated the rededication of its Bridgetown Synagogue.
The event which commemorated the rededication of the Bridgetown Synagogue in 1987 was a major day in my life. And it was, in many ways, the signature to the effort that we carried out to save the synagogue. And it was quite an event. So we had somewhere over 200, maybe 300 delegates from all over the British Commonwealth.
But the revitalized Jewish community was not done restoring the history of the Sephardic Jews of Barbados.
The cemetery restoration project is something that started in the beginning of the 21st century. We recognize the fact that not only is it important because of tourism, because of our heritage, and because of history, as we need a cemetery. And this is the only Jewish cemetery in Barbados.
The Spanish or Portuguese inscriptions are themselves very interesting, and I know that many of the Sephardim were very attuned to Kabbalistic beliefs and mystical beliefs. And from work done on Sephardic cemeteries in other parts of the world, my reading shows me that there is this Kabbalistic or mystical or messianic reference or connection there.
We managed to have someone come here from London who guided that work, and it was done, I can tell you, as professionally and as much according to the Jewish law as anyone could do it.
And speaking of London,
finally, when I was restoring the graveyard, I went back at Bevis Marks and I said, okay, the graveyard and the graves that we are restoring seem to all have Sephardic names. Can you help us? And they said, they broke down, they said, if you're restoring the Sephardic graves, we will help. And what do you think they sent us? They sent us the equivalent of £500 sterling.
Yes, the 500 pounds Bevis Marks received in 1925 upon sale of the synagogue. And that involvement may have softened the prior recalcitrants of Sephardic-affiliated Bevis marks working with this new Ashkenazi community in Barbados.
Until just about a year ago, through a friend of a friend, or a friend who has a home in Barbados who is friendly with a member of Bevis Marks, he got permission to have replicas made of what is known as the Remonim.
Which brings us to the third phase of the tireless work of the modern Jewish community of Barbados to honor the original Sephardic settlers on the island.
The museum was led with the initiative of Mr. Paul Altman. We thought also that this is something that we want to give back to Barbados. We thought that we're part of Barbados. The Jews were from the first settlers to Barbados. And I think by establishing a museum, not only are we proudly showcasing the Jewish life, but showcasing the importance of the history of the Jews and their contribution to Barbados.
Every time I have a visitor that I take and I do a tour of the synagogue, I have to tell them a story. And I'm not going to be here forever to tell them that story. So why don't I do something that tells that story so that they can find it out without me being here?
And so the museum opened in 2008, and inside artifacts from the 350 years of Jewish life in Barbados, dating back to the earliest settlement in the early 1600s.
The kippah we have here is known, it was a gift to Paul Altman for the museum. It is approximately 200 years old, and it is one of the oldest kippahs, if not the oldest kippah that we have right now. The bench itself, that was sold in 1925 and was given to the Barbados Museum, and as obviously for display, as a memento of the synagogue. And it was returned by the generosity of the Barbados Museum to us for display here. The artifacts you see in floor are really items that were thrown over the wall, discarded, and so on over the centuries. From as early as the early mid-1600s to as late as the early 1900s.
I have always felt that this was a special place, especially for kids. They need to learn the importance of the influence that the Jews had on Barbados. You know, there were over 300 that came as the first colony in the 17th century, and they were important for the development of the sugar cane, which became one of our main crops. So I thought they ought to do it, you know, not only to connect through the sugarcane aspect, but to see another culture. I think the museum, I think is well done. I think it's wonderful. You can actually feel life.
Now, while the museum was under construction, the grounds in front of the synagogue were excavated to uncover what they thought would be the rabbinical home. Never did Dr. Watson and his team dream what they would actually uncover. At the request of Paul Altman, Dr. Carl Watson and his PhD student Michael Stoner were excavating land in front of the synagogue in search of the rabbi's home.
I was at home having lunch, and my telephone rang, and it was Michael Stoner on the line, and he said, I found a marble step. What do I do? What do you think it is? He said, somebody on the compound thinks it might be a cellar. And I said, well, cellars will not have marble steps. You continue your excavation, I'm going to come down right now. So by the time I got down to the synagogue, they'd uncovered a second layer of steps, which were also marble. And we excavated down through to landing, and then we discovered we were excavating a rectangular stone structure, which went deeper and deeper. And we took out tons of debris. And when we were halfway down, alcoves started to appear. And then I got a long spade, and in one corner I dug and I put a steel rod down, and it came back with some moisture on the end. And I said to the class, I said, well, what we have here is probably the ritual bath.
Dr. Watson's team had unearthed a mikveh, a Jewish ritual purification and cleansing bath filled with natural water from the earth.
Honestly, it was a cathartic moment. It was like a spiritual moment, because as all the debris was cleared away from the corners of the rectangle, water started to bubble and clear crystal water rose. And it rose to what I consider to be the correct ritual height. And then, as if someone turned off a faucet, it stopped there and then. It was a very moving moment. I will tell you this on camera. I have a friend who has cancer. She's not Jewish, but when I told her the story of the filling of the mikveh, of the bath, she said, that water is holy, that water is sacred. Would I bring some for her? And I caught a little bottle and brought for her, and she drank it, and today she's in remission. So, you know, that's a very touching story.
I remember the day that Mr. Paul Altman called me, and we always joke on phone because of this or that, and he told me that we found a mikveh. I thought he was joking with me. After a few seconds, when I realized that he wasn't, I was, you know, in awe. I was shocked. I was amazed. How did we get to find it? Not only that, he told me it is in a almost perfect condition. A very spiritual moment.
The significance of the mikveh in my mind is that it ties it together. It says, wait a minute, a museum you can build, a synagogue you can restore, but this is the real thing.
The mikveh would have been created before the synagogue was built, because it is stated that if the Sephardim or Sephardics build a synagogue, they must build the mikveh before. It would have been built before 1654. As far as we know, it is the oldest full-size mikveh within the Americas.
But the Sephardic Jews of Barbados left more than their synagogue, their cemetery, their mikveh. While the modern population of Barbados may be 90% black, remember, Sephardic men in Barbados during the slave era did what men throughout the Americas did during slavery. They procreated with slaves and passed along their family names.
If you go to the telephone directory of Barbados today and you go through it, out jumps all these Sephardic names from the past. Well-known Sephardic names. To begin with, Aboab. I'll tell you an interesting story, because I was taking a roll call in class once, and this very beautiful young girl of mixed ancestry came in and she gave me her name, Ruth Aboab. And I said, oh my goodness, I know that name. That's a very famous Sephardic name. And she said, oh yes, well, you know, I am a Sephardic in ancestry because we've done our family tree. Depisa. Oh, there are many Depisas in Barbados today. Messiahs. There are white, brown, and black Messiahs on Barbados today, all descended from the original 17th century Messiahs of Barbados. Carvalho. There are many Carvalhos in the telephone directory. There are Pintos. You go through, you'll find the names. Da Costa.
Yes, Da Costa, one of the most well-known brand names in Barbados, operating both Da Costa's Mall and Da Costa Manning's appliance, electronics, and furniture store. And none other than the first Prime Minister of Barbados traces his ancestry to Sephardic Jews.
Errol Barrow, who was our first Prime Minister, claimed that he had Jewish ancestry. And he didn't only claim that, he knew that. And if you want more proof than that, you go into the graveyard in Bridgetown and you see Barrow, and next to it you see the grave of Baruch. So the Baruch was
While descendants of the original Sephardic Jews may not participate in modern Jewish life, all of Barbados, indeed the entire world, celebrates the renaissance of Jewish history and Jewish life on this beautiful Caribbean island.
I tell people that no matter what I will ever do in my lifetime, there will be nothing that will have more meaning and significance than the fact that I was able to save a part of the history of the Jews and part of the history of this island of Barbados.